Well, hey, and welcome to Overtime. My name is Jeremy, and this is a podcast where we take Sunday's message further in hopes that it becomes more helpful for you in your life and your faith. And as always, be sure to subscribe. As Buck likes to say, punch it, just press it, go after it, press subscribe. Make sure you are tuning in each week with all the content. But I am sitting here with Buck, our lead pastor. Buck, we did part 2 of Welcome Home this past week, which was a little bit of an uncomfortable one to jump into.
Absolutely.
But you started off sharing this amazing story, very humbling story.
I'm not sure it was amazing, but I appreciate that.
You're jumping out of a car because of a bee came into your car, so you sacrifice your son to the bee, and then something about hitting the pavement on the other side of the car.
Yeah, Luke will never forget that his whole life. Yeah. And that's hard because, I'm his dad, and he's like, okay, tell me your top 5 memories of your father. Well, let me tell you, number 3, he flew over me, face planted on the ground, sacrificed me to the bee.
Yeah, if you're listening and you haven't watched the message, I mean, the whole thing was great, but you just got to go watch the first couple minutes because, the story was so good. But how do you feel sharing that publicly, your son having that memory? How does that make you feel?
I don't know. We were talking before the podcast. I told you, it's just me. It's just, I just feel like, and it may be a bad thing. It may not be entirely healthy that I'm that comfortable sharing, hey, here's some of my big flaws, and I think there was a day that if I told you I freak out about bees, or I told you about what I talked about, a couple weeks ago with the anaconda. Yeah. I would not share that because I'm like, you may not like me. You may think I'm weird, but I don't know what happened. There's a switch somewhere along the way that I'm like, that's reality. That's my story. That's what I do. And I'm still in process working through all those things and trying to figure out why I'm so scared of bees.
Yeah. We'll just call it security. How about that? You're secure in all of that, who you are and everything.
So nice.
Yes.
It's very nice. Yeah.
All right, well, you started off talking about the bee, and then we jumped into a pretty big topic talking about hell. Mm-hmm. And I love some of the stuff you said at the beginning. I mean, you hit it, the nail on the head in the fact that the church and what a lot of, religious connotations that people have surrounding the topic of hell is that hell has been used in an abusive way. In talking about it. It's been used to manipulate and control people's fear, and it hasn't necessarily been unpacked in such a way that is palatable for a lot of people to go, okay, here's why this is significant to me, other than just I don't want to go there when I die.
Correct.
Here's why this is significant to me in my life and my faith, and here's how I live my life as a result of knowing more about this topic. It's been abused, and you unpacked that a little bit at the beginning of your message.
And I hope that I really hope that people were able to receive it. I mean, it's always a little bit awkward. I mean, I'm just one guy here in Greater Austin. And the church for centuries and centuries has used hell to manipulate, control, used hell to incite fear. And for me to just say, I'm really sorry. That's not what Jesus did. And the church is called the body of Christ and should be a reflection of Christ. And that's not how we have operated. So, for those of you listening who perhaps didn't hear that, on Sunday, I just said, man, I'm really sorry. On behalf of followers of Jesus Christ, on behalf of the church, I don't know if I can do that, but if it does take a step towards healing, I really hope you can receive that because an apology is needed.
Yeah, I love that. And you shared that Jesus talked about hell a ton, and it's just so interesting how little we talk about it in light of the fact that Jesus talked about it a ton. Exactly. Right, but it does make us really uncomfortable. Right. And one of the reasons I think it makes us uncomfortable is because of this big question that a lot of people have, and we're going to spend a good chunk of this podcast answering this question. And it is is why would a loving God send people to hell?
Yeah, I think that's the number one thing. I think, across the board when we were planning this series and talking about eternity, and I said, hey, I think, I've never spent a whole Sunday talking about hell. I've been teaching for 12 years as a pastor, and so certainly we have gone there. It's been part of messages, but to take a whole Sunday and do it, I was nervous, and I felt some apprehension, and so I asked a lot of people, hey, what do you think about this? And that was the number one question. Buck, we talk about God and that God is a God of love. How in the world could a loving God ever send someone to hell? And so, I addressed that a little bit. I addressed, I think of a lot of these questions are like a wheel with a lot of spokes. I wish there was just one spoke and it would answer everything. There are some questions like that, but this is one that I think requires multiple spokes to get the context, kind of more of a holistic answer. So, as I think about this, and especially on this podcast, this is not an exhaustive answer, but I do want to give a couple spokes to the question. And so I wrote down a few things. The first thing that I wrote down is, and this I find interesting, is that when you read Revelation, and Revelation is the last letter in the Bible, and it talks about eternity, talks about heaven, talks about hell, talks about the great white throne judgment, talks about, all these kind of things. And so you have this snapshot of people in eternity. You have the snapshot of people in heaven with God, and you have the snapshot of people going to hell. And in all of that, the thing that I am overwhelmed by is not one time throughout the whole scriptures, but not one time in Revelation do you find somebody saying, God, you're unjust. God, that's not fair. God, I cannot believe you sent me to hell. Which stands to reason that there's an acceptance. And that's what we see throughout the scriptures, is that there's a place to go, I have seen everything, like everything has been laid bare before the eyes of God, to whom we must give an account. All of my choices, all of my context, all of that's been laid bare. And it seems to paint a picture that people respond with, I may not like it, it may not, but an acceptance to go, okay, that's fair. That's fair. And that's really hard to wrap our minds around. And I was thinking about this, and I thought, it's like maybe, and none of these are going to do it justice, but it's like that concept to go, if you have a strong opinion and you're like, this is what's true, it's true, it's true. And, something I believe about Jill, or something I believe about the boys, or something I believe about a certain scenario. And then I'm presented with a much grander picture. And it's that aha moment that I go, oh, I just didn't know. I just didn't see all of it. And there's an acceptance to that. There's, okay, I get it now. Okay, I understand. This is the result of all of that context now. So it's a little bit like that. And if you were to combine that a little bit like, and this is not a great example as well, but it's where my mind goes. It's like grief. Grief has multiple stages. It's really difficult. But the final stage of grief is acceptance. Mm-hmm. And as hard and painful and emotional as everything is, there comes to this place to go, I accept it. Mm-hmm. And so if you were to kind of converge all of that, put all those pieces together, that's the picture that's painted in terms of people's eternity, specifically with hell. None of them push back against God, say that's unloving, that's not just, that's not fair. All of them, there's an acceptance. It's okay. And that's what we see, I think, in Romans chapter 2. Paul's painting this picture. Romans chapter 1 and 2, Paul paints this picture and says that God will judge fairly. In other words, I think it's really dangerous for Christians to go, well, you go to heaven, you go to hell, if, here's this kind of, I will judge your eternity. I think the scriptures give us a lot of clarity. I think we can present that to people, but I think ultimately who goes to heaven and hell, that's God. God is the final judge, and he is the perfect judge. He sees it all. He sees what happened when you were a little boy, little girl. He sees all the implications of your life. Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 1 and 2. He talks about, Jews have the law. So they're very aware of breaking the law of God and the consequences of that, but Gentiles don't have the law. But the law is written on their hearts, so they want to say, well, I don't have the law, so God, how can you judge me? Because I don't have the law. How can you judge something I do not have? But then Paul makes the point and says, but it's in your hearts. It's like God's law is written on your heart, and you obey the law of God, and even though you don't have it. But then he says, like in Romans chapter 2, he says, but all that's kind of mute. All that's kind of, yeah, I get it, but God will judge fairly. And he says all the secrets, I think it's in the Living Translation, all the secrets of man will be judged by God. And so I think it's really important to start there, is to say it's one of the spokes, but the idea is no one pushes against it and says it's unjust or it's unloving. You don't see that in Scripture. So that would be my first point.
Yeah.
That I would start with.
Yeah. Really quick on that too. I think it's good to talk about with this question. It's a very subjective question, and it's almost always asked from a very subjective place, meaning people are probably expecting some sort of answer that's going to emotionally satisfy everything going on in their heart and their mind. And because if hell is real, and if it is true, that should make us uncomfortable, and that's going to be really difficult to get to a place that is emotionally satisfying. You 100%. Know, and even as you talk about acceptance, and I think the stages of grief are a great analogy talking about that, like that acceptance. But you mentioned justice of God as part of it. I know you're going to unpack that a little bit more. What else would you say as it relates to this question?
Yeah, I think the other thing too, and I think this is what especially in conversations about eternity, about heaven and hell, is the second thing I wrote down. Is I said, just because we don't like something doesn't mean it's not true. There's a big emotional component to hell, and there should be. So I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think that's totally fair. But there's a big emotional reaction to that's unjust, that's not fair, that's not loving. And so therefore we push against it emotionally, and we believe that because our emotions will say it's not fair or I don't like it, therefore it's not true. Well, truth is truth if we like it or not. There are many things I don't feel like. And I talk about this from time to time on Sundays. My counselor said to me, a long time ago that, Buck, feelings aren't facts, and I need to be really careful with that statement. But just because I feel like Jill doesn't love me, some days I'm like, I don't think she loves me, or she finds me attractive, or these kind of things. My insecurities come out. Well, I feel that. So is that true? Yes, I feel that feeling is true. But the question I've got to ask is it true? Because in our culture today, where feelings are becoming more by definition truth, so it's like, what's the definition of truth? Well, truth is what I feel. That's a really slippery slope. That's a really fuzzy picture. That's a gray picture. And that I think ultimately leads to an enormous amount of confusion. So if we feel it and we go, I don't like the concept of hell, it makes me mad, it makes me angry, it makes me question, perfect. We should be honest with those. But that doesn't negate the fact that it's true. Truth, by definition, is narrow. If my phone number is 555-777, because I like sevens, 2222, and you go, well, Buck, I don't like those numbers. Okay, well, that's true. That's the way you feel. And it's important to acknowledge that and, research those feelings and where they come from. But it doesn't negate the fact that's my number. Yeah. That's true. And we can't get around that. So I think that's important to understand, that we have a big emotional reaction, but it doesn't negate the fact that hell is real. And I would say hell is real based on Jesus. Jesus came into the world, and as you alluded to earlier, he talked about eternity all the time. He talked about heaven. He talked about hell. But here's the thing, and here's what's really important. And this is where I think the church has got it wrong. Jesus didn't come to use it as a fear tactic. Jesus didn't come to use it to control people. Jesus came as somebody who would come, who loves and who cares about people and who understands what's on the other side of this life. And the scriptures are really clear. Jesus came from heaven. In fact, from Jesus' own lips, he said, I am the bread of life. I have come from heaven. I understand eternity. I understand there's a difference between heaven and hell, and I have come not to use it as a fear tactic, but to warn you, because I love you. I care for you. And I'm going to do everything in my power. And Jesus did it. He gave his life to that extent to ensure that you are saved from that eternity of hell. And I love, because that would mean, just like I shared, much more silly example, but of me with my sons and bees. Mm-hmm. I love them. I care for them. I'm going to warn them. In the same way, with a much more serious and consequential topic, Jesus says, I have come to warn you, not to scare or not to fear or not to control and manipulate. And so that was my hope on Sunday. It was just a message of, here's the words of Jesus. It's more of a warning, and it really comes from a place of care and a place of love. Yeah. So I think that's the second thing, is just because we emotionally don't agree or it's not emotionally satisfying, it doesn't negate the fact that it's true. Yeah. So I think that would be a spoke.
So the first one, kind of what we see in Revelation, acceptance of hell. Second one, the idea that truth by definition has to be exclusive, right? And then I think those are like good things to think about as we, think about this question, but what actually answers the question?
So that's more on the periphery. So it's like we're kind of taking this journey, if you will.
Right.
So as we walk down the path, we're getting to a place to go, okay, now explain it. So to begin to explain, why would a loving God send somebody to hell? One, I think it's important to understand that God is love. In 1 John, it says, John describes Jesus as love, and Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. So he says, I'm telling you, if you had to describe God, who is God? God is love. That he's 100% love. He is perfect in his love. And I alluded to this on Sunday, and I said, because God is love, that when God created the world, he had to create a world that is the best possible scenario of a world to create. And I've shared this, several months ago, but that idea that God could have created a multitude of worlds. He could have created, no world. He could have created a world that is an automaton world. He could have created a world where there's only good, and that's all you could ever choose. But all of those worlds are void of love. None of those have love. Love's impossible to be in those worlds. The only world that is the best possible world, because love is the supreme ethic. The only world he could have created that's the best possible world is the world we live in. And it's a world created from the starting point foundationally with love. But when you create a world with love, you have to create a world with a freedom of choice. And that's why in the very beginning of the Bible, letter of Genesis, people always ask, why did God put a tree? All these kind of things. He had to, because he created the world with a capacity for love. And if he forced Adam and Eve, the very first human beings, if he forced them to love him, that by definition is no longer love. That's compulsion, that's compliance. It's not love. Love by definition requires a component of your will that is 100% free to choose to love or choose not to love. Mm-hmm. Because by definition, if I choose to love you, then it is genuine, true love. So he had to put a tree in the garden. So he did that. And in the very beginning, he knew that man had the capacity to trust and love and produce wonderful things in this world. And he also knew that man had the capacity and the freedom of will that he will not violate to choose to not trust him and corrupt and break and pervert the world. And therefore, that brings the second point of who God is, which God is not only a God of love, but God is a God of justice. Paul says in Romans chapter 12, he says, God will say, I take the vengeance. One of the reasons why, you hear these verses like, hey, pray for your enemies and, those who persecute you and bless them and turn the other cheek. And you're like, what? I'll take justice in my hands. What we know is that God will carry out the final, justice. He'll carry out the final judgment. He will take vengeance on those who do wrong. And so one of the things that it's very clear throughout the scriptures, and you can read this in the Old Testament, New Testament, that God is not only 100% love, but he's 100% just. And God is love, but that doesn't mean God loves all things. I mean, God is very clear that God hates sin. And that's a strong statement, but it's important. I mean, God hates lying. God hates murder. God hates, and this is hard to say, rape. God hates racism. God hates abuse. He hates it. And because he does, and because he is loving, it doesn't mean if somebody does that or that happens in the world, that he's just going to go, oh, it's fine, I'm just a loving God. I mean, none of us would want that. We would be indignant about that. We would say, no, justice must be carried out.
Yeah, like if we're standing in the courtroom and it's no, never mind, he's good, he just goes off.
Oh, yeah.
We would be furious.
And especially, that's something in all of us. And I would say that's important to pay attention to. If you're not a Christian, if you're an agnostic, if you've been hurt by the church, or if you are a Christian, it's interesting. There's something in all of us that gets indignant and gets extraordinarily upset when there's injustices. Mm-hmm. When we see somebody make a racist choice, all the way to the extent of murder, there's something inside of us that says that is not right. Justice must be carried out. When we see a little child, something that's so abusive, and in my role as a pastor and what I hear that happens behind closed doors when I hear things, there are things that I'm like, this is wrong. I'm angry about it. And we should be angry because there's an injustice. Well, that part of us is the God part. We are made in the image of God. And God is 100% love, but he's also 100% just, and he will deal with the wrongs. Paul makes it very clear, I will pay, my judgment and justice will pay for those wrongs. And those wrongs and those, when we cross lines and we do those things and the brokenness in this world, those eventually, those wrongs will be paid for in eternity in what Jesus describes as hell. And that's a hard one. And it's hard, and the problem with that is I think we're all guilty. I think that the challenge with that is, if I think, well, those are the extreme, because we think, well, it's the worst of the worst. It's like the Hitlers, the Stalins, the Maos. I mean, they've killed millions of people. Of course they should go to hell. I mean, that should be the case. But the reality is we've all broken God's law. And if God hates sin, we've all sinned. And I'll be super personal. I mean, I sin every single day. Like, I don't think there's a day of my life that I have not sinned. And that may be weird to say, but like either I wake up in a selfish way, I have terrible thoughts, I act out of my brokenness, I'm greedy, I may lie. I mean, there's not a day that goes by that I'm like, man, the whole day I didn't sin, and that's a big, big problem, because if God is 100% just and I've broken his law, as the scriptures say, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, then I deserve hell as well.
There has to be a penalty.
Has to be. Justice.
For him to be perfectly just, there has to be a penalty.
Has to be. Because by definition, he would no longer be God if he wasn't perfect in his justice, for small or great. So basically, if you looked at the big landscape and you looked at the scriptures, I mean, Paul says really clearly in Romans 6, for the wages of sin is death, for the wages of sin is hell. I'm going to hell. I mean, we've all broken God's law. And this is where God's love and Christianity become incredibly beautiful, because God is not only a God of a perfect justice, but he's also a God of love, which means that God sees the problem, and he sees we're all going there. We've all broken his law. And so he steps in and he says, I'm going to do something about it because I love you, kiddo. And he sends his one and only son, Jesus Christ, because for God so loved you, and he sees the condition. And he sends Jesus Christ into the world to live a perfect life I could not live, to be a perfect sacrifice for his perfect justice, so that I could put my faith and trust in him and not my good works, not my good abilities, because every day I sin. I could put my trust and faith in him. And through his perfect life and through his sacrifice on the cross, it satisfies the justice of God for my sin. So I am redeemed, I am forgiven, I am reconciled with God, and when I put my faith and trust in God, or in Jesus Christ, I am called a son, or if a person puts their faith and trust in Christ, they are called a daughter of God. And the beauty of the cross of Jesus Christ is it's a picture of God's perfect love in the person of Jesus Christ, satisfying God's perfect justice for our sin. That is a distinctive in Christianity. All other religions, it comes like mercy and forgiveness come in
at the expense
of God. It's only in Christianity, through his love, is his justice satisfied for my sin. So I can spend eternity with God in heaven. And that's a beautiful thing. And so when I think about God, I'm like, man, God, you created the most perfect world you could have, a world that has a capacity to love, the most supreme ethic, that I can experience love in this world, but a world that also has freedom. And so you have to be just, and you have to be loved to deal with the injustices in the world. But you didn't leave us alone. Your love just was extravagant and demonstrated in the person of Jesus Christ, where you gave something for me because you love me, to satisfy your justice and to demonstrate your love all at the same time. And then you give me the freedom to choose to love and trust, or choose not to love and trust. And that was kind of, that last point I just made, what I said on Sunday, that in essence, God doesn't send people to hell. He gives us the freedom to choose. And we can choose to trust, or we can choose not to trust. And that's why I quoted what C.S. Lewis quoted, and he said, hell, the door of hell is locked from the inside. Mm-hmm. In other words, whoever's listening right now, as I said on Sunday, has a choice in this very moment to choose their eternity. God will not violate that freedom of will. And so I think that, God of love, justice, heaven, hell, it's a whole lot to say. And I'm just touching on some of the, aspects of this question. But that as we begin to wade into these waters and answer that question, that's basically what I would say.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. 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 Well, I think that's really helpful. And I, for me, when I first asked similar questions and started learning a little bit about the justice of God, I had to go back and re-listen and reread and re-listen and reread, because these are big topics for us to try to digest and let it sink down from our head to our heart. And when it does, though, it's eye-opening, it's clarifying, and so I appreciate you unpacking it the way you did. And as you were talking, it made me think of an analogy I heard at one point, and I think this perhaps is just another small spoke on the wheel in the question of why would a loving God send people to hell? Like, why hell? Like, why eternal punishment? And I remember somebody phrasing it this way, is with the greater authority comes greater punishment. And so, when we're kids and we do something against our parents, we're grounded. Like, it's just to our parents. When we run a red light and we get pulled over, like there's a bigger consequence than just a grounding, because we are going against the law of our city, our community, our state, nation, that kind of thing. When we do something in the eyes of the Supreme Court that gets all the way to the Supreme Court, now there's much bigger punishment at that point, because greater authority, the Supreme Court of the United States. And when you think about the size of God, and if God is infinitely big, the authority of the Supreme Court is a drop in the ocean compared to the authority of God.
Right.
And that even doesn't do it justice if God is infinitely large and omnipresent and big. And so for me, that brought to light, like, I always wondered, well, why hell? Like, why this place of, eternal punishment? Well, with greater authority comes greater punishment, and that perfect justice component comes in and really brings to light, how we can kind of objectively make our way through this question. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And the beauty is in all of that, and I want to be careful with my words, because there's nothing beautiful about hell. But the beauty is what God did in light of that he sees our condition. He sees the problem. And God didn't abandon us. He didn't back away. He didn't go, hey, figure it out. Hey, work harder. Hey, do more. Hey, suck it up. Hey, get smarter. No, he said, I love you. I love you, and I'm going to do everything I can to win you. I'm going to put all this evidence everywhere in this world. I'm going to put evidence in my creation. I'm going to put evidence in relationships. I'm going to put evidence on the internet. I'm going to put evidence everywhere that points you to the fact that I am real. My son, Jesus Christ, lived, died, and rose from the dead. And you can make a choice of faith. That faith is confidence. It's not an emotion. It's confidence based on the evidence. And you can put your faith and trust in me. God did something about it. And that's why the gospel is called good news. God loved you. And that's what I ended with. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life with God in heaven.
Yeah. Well, that's really good. And I want to ask one more thing before we wrap up.
Sure.
And we go on to part 3 of Welcome Home.
Oh, yeah.
Coming to terms with hell is uncomfortable, obviously, and it's getting to the place where it is an objective answer is difficult, but it changes the way we see life as we do. As a person who believes in what you just talked about, and as a Christian, what does a healthy life look like if we're trying to live with heaven and hell in mind?
Yeah, I think there's several ways I could answer this. Maybe tomorrow I'd answer it a little bit differently.
Yeah.
But I think, one, it's, I think when I was younger in my faith, I got wrapped up a lot in like, oh my gosh, eternity, and, I've got, and it kind of created this hyperness, this overreaction, this, oh my gosh, I have to. And this is where the first point I made, God is ultimately the judge. I don't know if people are going to heaven and hell. I mean, I can only reach so far in terms of what I know and what God shows us through the scriptures. But then God has got to be God, and we've got to be human, and we can only reach so far. So knowing that God is going to be fair, that God doesn't judge with partiality in terms of like, it's all going to be fair. It's all going to be just. It's all going to be right. It's all going to be perfect. It's all going to be loving. And when we see all the judgment take place and everything accounted for, we're going to accept it. We're going to go, oh, okay. Okay. So that gives me an incredible amount of peace in my life to go, there is a good, loving, fair, and just God that will make the final call. That's important. And then I think in terms of what Jesus said, Jesus came from heaven, and he, warned us over and over and over about eternity. And he did everything he could, even to the point of giving his life, taking his life back up to punctuate the fact that eternity is real and that he is the way, the truth, and the life. And then he looks at me and looks at you and looks at followers of Jesus and says, go. Like, go love as I have loved you. He gives us a standard of love, gives us a brand new command, love as Jesus Christ have loved. That's number one. And then he goes, now go and make disciples of all nations. Go do everything you can. Leverage all the gifts I have given you. Leverage what you have, your time, your resources, to go inspire people, lead people, love people into a relationship with Jesus Christ. And so as I think about eternity and as I think we get clarity on eternity, it is extraordinarily compelling in the best of ways to go, okay, today I don't feel like loving, but I know there's a real eternity and there's a real God, and God loved me. Okay, I'm going to love my neighbor. I'm going to bring them cookies. Jill cooks the cookies, but, I'm going to bring them cookies. I'll help them rake their, there are times that I feel like I don't feel like, forgiving somebody. But you know what? I'm going to go back to the place that this can impact not only my life, but the lives on the other side of me. You know what? I'm going to use my resources. I could do so many other things with my resources, but I'm going to use those resources to do everything I can to inspire and lead people into a growing relationship with Jesus Christ, or ultimately just to follow Jesus Christ. So it just puts kind of a tip on the end of a point to go like, it's real. Jesus gave his life, and eternity is real, and I have a finite amount of time. One of the most purposeful, meaningful things I could do with my life. And, that's what really inspired Jill and I to make the move from Dell, 12 years ago to start North Point, is to go, man, I want to create a place that people don't go to church, and create a movement that people don't go to church love to engage with. And what can we do? How can we be available? And how can we pray for our neighbor? And how can we love our neighbor? And, all those kind of things. So, yeah, that's how I'd answer it today. But ask me tomorrow, I may answer it differently.
So you're saying, in light of this conversation, we should all go start a church. And
Although I told you I had a conversation with a guy the other day who said, he said he went to heaven. He heard my part one, and he was like, hey, I need to talk with you. And he said, man, I died. He actually died 6 times, and he shared his whole story, and he said he went to heaven. And his response was just that. I was like, so what are you going to do? Like, you have this new information. And he said, I called my brother-in-law, and I think I'm going to start a church. And I was like, okay.
That's awesome.
Go for it. So anyways, yeah.
Well, thanks for starting that church, North Point, so long ago. It's impacted my life and so many other people. Yeah. So,
well, a great team did that. So, there's a bunch of people who came along, did that.
Yep. Well, cool. Well, I think that wraps us up for Overtime today. We're going to be jumping into part 3 next week, which is really, really exciting because we were talking about heaven. And a lot of people have the question of, what is heaven really like? And we're going to be unpacking that. What is heaven really like? And so, as always with this series, be sure to text Overtime to 97000 if you have a question about this series, about the content, about any topic relating to eternity. And we're going to try to do our best to answer those questions here on the podcast that releases on Wednesdays. And so, Buck, any last thoughts, any words?
No, just part 3, a question you may have: are there beaches in heaven? Mm-hmm. I don't know.
Are there dogs in heaven?
Are there dogs in heaven?
Yep.
Is there, adventure in heaven? Are there golf courses in heaven?
Yep.
We're going to actually answer those questions.
In my mind is, are there golf courses in heaven?
Yeah. Of course, I knew that.
Yeah. Well, anyways, thanks so much for listening, Buck. Thanks so much for being part of the podcast.
You got it. Thank you, man.